The Blacklighters just pulled off what every miner dreams of, striking a seam of rare white and crystal opal that could fetch a jaw-dropping $65,000. This isn't your everyday find. This seam flashes fire across every angle, shimmering with colors collectors will fight to own. In one strike, they've turned weeks of grueling, dust-choked work into a discovery that rewrites the season. Dealers are already circling, rumors are spreading, and the buzz on the ground is explosive. Everyone wants to know just how much more could be hiding in that pocket. If the seam runs deep, we're talking about a payday that could eclipse anything they've seen before. And here's the kicker. The opal market is hotter than ever. A single clean crystal could sell at auction for a small fortune. And the Blacklighters are sitting on a vein that shows no signs of stopping. This isn't hype. It's history in the making for their crew. Don't miss what happens next, because if this seam keeps delivering, we could be watching the birth of one of the richest opal hauls in recent years. Hit like, smash subscribe, and stay locked in. This story's only getting bigger. The ridge was quiet that morning, dust hanging in the air, when the Blacklighters lowered their gear into the shaft. Routine. Another day of chasing faint promises in ground that had fooled miners for more than a century. Picks struck, machines rumbled, and then silence. The engine coughed once and died, leaving only the echo of dripping water deep underground. One of the crew bent low to check the rock face and froze. A glimmer cut through the gloom. Not coal, not potch, but a living fire trapped in stone. Flashes of green and red sparked out like eyes waking in the dark. Every breath in the shaft caught at once. Cameras swung in. No one spoke, because everyone knew. The ground itself had just spoken. The lead miner scraped gently, peeling back layers of sandstone. And there it was, the unmistakable shimmer of a white and crystal seam opal. Dealers had another name for it. Ghost fire. Not common like potch, not dark like black opal, but clear, pale bodies of stone hiding lightning bolts within. One wrong move, and the find could fracture to worthless shards. One right move, and this could be the strike that made their names immortal in Lightning Ridge. Nervous glances flickered across the faces of the crew. They weren't holding just rock. They were holding destiny. Floodlights were hauled down, their beams slicing through the shaft's haze. What they revealed made men swear under their breath. The seam ran clear across the wall, colors trapped like storms beneath ice. Every flake chipped away brought new surprises. Rolling bands of green, flickers of blue, sudden orange bursts, and then blood red, the rarest fire of all. Some geologists whispered in awe. Transparent crystal with fire bands was rarer even than black opal in these fields. In silence, the Blacklighters stared. Their hands itched to strike deeper, but fear held them back. Everyone knew a hammer swung too hard could turn a $10,000 gem into dust on the floor. They were chasing treasure balanced on a knife's edge. By nightfall, the ridge wasn't quiet anymore. Word spread faster than whiskey pours, and the old miners gathered in the pub. Cigarette smoke curled, beer taps hissed, and stories resurfaced like ghosts. Lightning Ridge has always lived on tales of overnight fortune and sudden ruin. Men recalled the boom of the 1960s, when white seam opal pulled families out of poverty, only to plunge others into debt. One voice spoke of the phantom seam, a cursed vein that shimmered bright one week and vanished the next, leaving men with nothing but gambling debts and broken tools. Heads nodded grimly. The Blacklighters weren't just breaking into rock. They were stepping into a cycle older than themselves, one where the earth gives with one hand and destroys with the other. Were they lucky or cursed? In the pub that night, no one could say. But one thing was certain. The weight of history had settled heavy on their shoulders, and the ridge was watching what they'd do next. That unease didn't stay in the bar. When the crew descended back into the shaft, It clung to them like dust. The braces groaned as if echoing the warnings from upstairs. Each creak a reminder of how many stories had ended beneath this ground. Every strike of the pick sent shivers through the rock, dust falling in choking clouds that forced the Blacklighters to strap on masks. The air grew heavier, the silence sharper, until every sound, every groan of timber, every pebble tumbling from above, felt like a countdown. Then, without warning, a slab gave way. It sheared off the wall and slammed into the floor with a crack that echoed like thunder, missing one miner by inches. His face went pale in the floodlight's glare, and no one had to say what they were all thinking. The ridge wasn't done testing them. They worked on anyway, sweating under the masks, carving deeper into stone that widened into promise, but also into peril. With every inch the seam opened, so did the risk that the earth would swallow them whole. When they finally hauled up the first load, the crew knew they weren't just pulling dirt anymore. Spread across the sorting table lay their first real glimpse of what the ridge had been hiding: an 8.5-carat white opal, milky with bands of fire, and beside it a 12-carat crystal seam. Flawless, light bending through it like stained glass. Under daylight lamps, the stones came alive, red fire burning at the edges, purple flickers running through the heart, gold sparks flashing like buried suns. Collectors would kill for colors like these. Local buyers didn't bother hiding their excitement. Phones lit up, estimates thrown down, $20,000 in just the first bucket, and the seam still ran deep. If it held, the total could break $65,000, a figure that in ridge terms meant not just money, but legend. Dealers began circling like hawks. Calls buzzed through the night, each buyer desperate to outbid the last before the stones ever touched the market. But in Lightning Ridge, no fortune stays secret for long. By the second night, rival miners in the pub were already whispering, voices dripping with suspicion. Some claimed the Blacklighters were exaggerating, spinning stories to inflate prices. Others weren't so sure. Men began drifting toward the claim after dark, boots crunching near the boundaries, flashlights darting like predators' eyes. Fence lines were tested, locks rattled. The Blacklighters answered by planting trespass signs and splitting their crew into watch shifts. One man always armed with a spotlight and a hand on the gate. Tension spilled back into the pub, where beer-stained tables became battlegrounds. Words were exchanged, threats muttered, fists half raised before being pulled down again. Every miner in town knew greed when they smelled it, and now Lightning Ridge was a powder keg waiting for the spark. The seam had given the Blacklighters fire and stone, but it had also drawn envy, and envy in the ridge was just another name for war. War, to the Blacklighters, meant one thing: dig faster, dig deeper, and make the ground itself their shield. Floodlights roared to life over the shaft, painting the night in harsh white as buckets of dirt were hauled up and poured into the sluice. Each wash was a gamble, every shimmer in the waterbed a surge of hope. Then came the fragment, a shard so clear it seemed made of glass, sliced by a crimson bar of fire that burned like a wound across its face. A flagstone. The word carried weight, whispered like a spell, because flagstones were the kind of opal that rewrote fortunes. One miner held it up, light breaking into a blaze of red that stained his gloves like blood. They all knew it then. This was the best material pulled from Lightning Ridge in years, maybe decades. Spirits soared, exhaustion forgotten as the rough tally climbed past $35,000. But even as they cheered, the floodlights stretched their shadows long across the dirt, and someone muttered that shadows this sharp never fall without a cost. By dawn, the word had already traveled farther than the shaft. Dusty utes rolled in first, then polished sedans from Sydney and Melbourne, headlights cutting through the early mist. Out stepped men in tailored suits, their shoes already coated in ridge dirt, briefcases clicking open to reveal neat stacks of cash. First offers hit the table fast. $40,000 for partial lots, a tempting figure for stone still damp from the ground. But it wasn't enough. Not when the seam whispered of more. The crew gathered tight, voices low, debating whether to cash in quick and walk safe, or hold out for the kind of payday miners dreamed of but rarely lived to see. Then a stranger stepped forward, different from the city buyers. Foreign accent, sharp eyes, no smile. He didn't flash bills. He offered a promise. 6 figures, if they could deliver intact stones over 50 carats. A prize that might not even exist. Yet the seed was planted. Greed bloomed quick. Each man began to picture his share, the kind of number that could buy land, cars, freedom. For the first time, cracks ran through loyalty, invisible but deep, each man wondering if the others would sell him out. Down in the shaft, the stone didn't care about their arguments. The seam ran on, pushing deeper into earth that resisted every strike. Picks gave way to drills, drills to blasting caps, each thunderclap leaving the shaft walls trembling. Braces groaned like dying beasts, rock dust raining in choking curtains. One miner, voice hoarse, shouted they had gone far enough, that another blast would bring the whole tunnel down. His warning met with jeers, curses, even shoves. Others snarled that fortune was just ahead, that turning back now would be cowardice worse than poverty. Arguments echoed through the dark like gunfire, loyalty breaking under the weight of glittering stone. Fists nearly flew, only pulled back by the thought of what still lay waiting in the seam. But the wedge was already driven. The seam wasn't just splitting rock, it was splitting men, each swing of the pick driving them closer to collapse. Somewhere above, the ridge watched, silent, patient, waiting to see which would give first, the earth or the men who thought they could master it. And still, they drove forward. Resentment gave way to grim silence, every man chained to the same hunger. The seam narrowed into a dangerous funnel, a corridor of stone that felt alive, breathing with each strike of the pick. The air inside the shaft was heavy with dust and diesel fumes, lantern light catching particles that hung like ghosts in the tunnel. Then came a moment no one on the crew would ever forget. A dull crack, softer than usual, followed by a gleam so bright it seemed unnatural. Hands froze. A crowbar wedged against the rock, pried with agonizing slowness, and from the collapsing sandstone came a fragment so large, so impossibly intact, it silenced the entire shaft. A single piece of crystal seam, thick as a man's fist, slid into the waiting hands of the foreman. Floodlights caught it, and for a second the tunnel was filled with fire trapped in ice. Reds bled into blues, golds shimmered like molten sunlight, and lightning streaks of green shot across the stone as if alive. It was no ordinary find. Nearly 50 carats of flawless crystal seam, cut straight from the ridge's heart. The kind of opal that doesn't just sell, it defines eras. The crew passed it hand to hand, reverent, as though touching a holy relic. Under daylight lamps, the colors grew even bolder, screaming across the surface with a clarity so pure even hardened dealers would weep. One whispered the word flagship, another murmured museum piece, and a third dared to call it immortal fire. The valuation came quick, the kind that leaves men shaking. $15,000 for that single stone, and that was conservative. Dealers watching from the surface cameras muttered that it might fetch double in the right city, Sydney or Hong Kong, maybe even more. When the stone was set beside the week's earlier haul, white seam fragments, crystal pieces, blood-red flashes, the tally edged past $65,000. A number that would crown them in Lightning Ridge history, whispered alongside the great finds of the 1960s boom. But there was no cheering. Not really. Not like before. Instead, there was silence, broken only by the sound of boots shifting uneasily in gravel. The men knew what they had pulled, but they also knew what it might cost. For in the ridge, Legends live as real as dust and diesel. And one story came back louder than the rest, that every great opal seam demanded payment. Old miners called it the phantom's toll. Blood for fire, flesh for stone. Nobody talked about it openly, but everyone felt it. One of the crew, face pale beneath a mask of grime, muttered that he'd seen it before. A mate crushed after pulling a seam of crystal. Another buried alive chasing a vein of white fire. "Opal eats men," he said flatly, and for the first time since the discovery, nobody argued. That night, sleep didn't come easy. The camp was restless, filled with creaks and whispers. One miner swore he dreamed of walls closing in, the seam itself reaching out to pull him under. Another woke screaming, convinced the gem was glowing from the corner of the room. Machines began to fail without reason. Generators coughing into silence, drills refusing to start, wires sparking through untouched. A shovel snapped clean in half, steel fractured as though it had rusted through. To some, it was coincidence, to others, proof. The phantom seam had woken, and it wanted its toll. The tension cracked a man's nerve. One crew member walked out before sunrise, hands trembling as he packed his gear. He swore no amount of money was worth dying underground, no stone worth being buried alive. His words hit hard. "You'll all be rich corpses." He left without looking back, headlights fading into the dust. The others watched in silence, torn between envy of his freedom and fear that he'd curse them by walking away. Still, greed is a louder voice than superstition. The remaining men doubled down, working longer hours, their hands blistering, their eyes hollow with obsession. Dealers from Sydney and Melbourne kept circling, offers rising with every rumor that slipped through the pubs. Some talked of 6 figures if a larger stone could be pulled intact. A foreign buyer's shadow loomed, hinting at briefcases filled with cash, contracts ready to sign. But none of it mattered to the crew now. The stone wasn't just money, it was proof. Proof that their gamble, their sleepless nights, their fights and fears had carved a name for them in Ridge lore. When the final valuation came, it confirmed what they already knew. Over $65,000 in seam opal, split between white and crystal fire, the best haul the Ridge had seen in years. Word spread fast, faster than dust on a summer wind. The Blacklighters were no longer just another crew, they were a legend, spoken of in the same breath as the old-timers who'd pulled fortunes from dirt and vanished into history. Their names would be remembered, carved in whispers across pubs and shafts alike. Yet even as the numbers sang, questions lingered in the tunnels, because the seam had not ended. It pushed deeper, darker, further than their lights could chase. The find wasn't exhausted, it was only beginning, and that meant 2 possibilities: fortune beyond imagination, or a grave wide enough to bury them all. The oldest hands muttered that they had stumbled onto the phantom seam itself, a vein that appeared once in a generation, glittered with untold wealth, and then sealed itself in ruin and collapse. For the crew, the stones were no longer just gems. They were myths, hardened into reality, legends turned tangible in their calloused hands. Every flash of red fire, every bar of green lightning, was proof that dreams and curses could be the same thing, split by the thin edge of a miner's pick. And as the last floodlight dimmed and the shaft groaned under the weight of untouched treasure below, the Blacklighters knew they had not just struck Paydirt, they had carved themselves into the eternal story of Lightning Ridge, where fortune and fate burned together in fire and stone.